and welcome to Acageekmia. I'm Elaine. I'm Acageekmia. This particular show is going to be about is focusing a little bit more exclusively on geek culture. That is to say, what is a geek? Who is a geek? What does it mean to identify as a geek? Geek culture was before and how it's evolved, where it came from, if you will. And a lot of this is going to intersect then deeper into some deeper questions about society, which is awesome because really we're just looking at geek culture as a microscope through which to make observations and generalizations about our society at large. And hopefully we can take moments then to reflect on what these things mean to us in terms of creating ideas or concepts of ourselves and who we are in this world and who we are to each other and how we relate to each other and how that means we've related to each other in order to create a society. So we're looking at issues of race, gender, nation, and all these aspects in terms of the geek culture. Stuart Hall, who I've put in the description box a link to the Wikipedia page explaining who he is, and it has a couple of the links of his work that he's looked at. But Stuart Hall pretty much examined all of culture. He was he was originally from West Indies and immigrated to Britain as a young man, and a lot of his studies included immigrant studies and identity. But especially brought in this idea of studying the popular culture as opposed to just what is considered high culture and low culture. And high culture would be an example such as opera. And in a more traditional school of thought, studying high culture was more socially valuable in studying society and life. But it left out an entire part of society, the working classes. So especially in his work, Notes on Deconstructing the Popular, he argued that cultural productions of the popular, which was productions of the working or labor classes, is a process that not just whereby people buy into cultural productions or where but that it was a site where the working class can create culture, create culture of their own, and this culture that's created challenges the ruling classes in ways that were completely unexpected. And it's an attempt to wrest control in a way. So to study the popular culture then is to study what Stuart Hall calls containment and resistance. You have the ruling classes and the labor classes who are in constant tension with each other, but it's not this idea that we're just being fed things. It's this idea that at the same time, the lower classes, middle classes, not this class, can challenge the other class in a way and create this culture that becomes far more popular. And it's not just for the sake of entertainment always, it's for the sake of expressing certain social critiques and ideas and values that are then adopted. And so all of these things is to examine power plays at work in which our society is developed then, because it's very important to understand how the different power plays work between us in developing our society. And that's why we look at popular culture, because everything in your life is subscribed meaning. Whether you subscribe meaning to it or someone else, everything has a meaning to it, and for every person that meaning may be different. But those meanings may also be socially derived. And you have to look at where you've developed your meanings, how those meanings developed, why they developed is also quite significantly important in figuring out who really has control in your society, and what does that mean in terms of what your society looks like and how it can change. Geek culture was a subculture, not necessarily within the popular, especially when we look at what this first episode is going to be about. And essentially though, as time has gone by, geek culture has become so phenomenally popular. So this first episode will look at the etymology of the word geek. We're actually going to look at where geek comes from, where it originated from, and look at how it evolved. Ray Williams, who passed away in the 1980s, who created a book called Keywords. And what he did is he did and it's now somebody followed it up with the Keywords Project, and I put the link down in the description for you there. And this is looking at words in society and taking a word and following its etymology, looking where it came from, looking when it first originated, and especially looking at how it changed over time, and especially space, because the same words are sometimes used very differently in different places and at different times. Etymology dictionary online, geek actually derived from the Low German word meaning crazy, foolish, idiot, stupid, things like that. And it was around the 16th century that this was the word that was the way in which the word was used. And it wasn't until 1916 that the word was first used in the US as a slang term in the carnival and circus arenas to describe the sideshow or the sideshow's performers or freak shows. These performers took on what they called a wild man roles, and that actually appeared more in 1970, which described sideshow performers who would perform acts of madness or craziness, such as, well, biting off the head of a chicken, or biting off the heads or chunks of pieces of animals on stage. And this was for people to see. And, well, that's how it was originally used to describe them. And then it wasn't actually that the word showed up in print, apparently, first in 1947 in a novel, and then again in the 1970s, which was relating the wild man role. The word then doesn't actually really show up again until the 1980s, where it takes a bit of a turn. Whereas in the 1970s, it was pretty much solidified as meaning weirdo or person which does not exactly fit within the normal people's realm. In the 1980s, we see the circumvention or the creation of technology at a whole new level, such as computers coming up. And so technology is advancing, and it requires these people who are very technical savvy. But technical savvy people then were stereotyped as being socially awkward or slightly weird. So geek then changed only slightly in terms that it now started to, whereas it was about sideshow freak, the sideshow and the freak performers and things like that, it now became someone who was computer savvy and technical but socially awkward. And if you look at movies from the 1980s and 1990s, the way in which geek representations are made, this follows along in that sense quite a bit. Now, technology continues to improve, globalization allows the world to become a little bit smaller, we share a lot about technology and it just advances. The need for more technical advanced people increases. We need mathematicians, scientists. It becomes very important, especially in terms of NASA programs and things like that, space races, arms races, things like that. And so geek begins to change slightly from a negative. Geeks are very much wanted and needed and looked as positive. And we see the shift slightly in the 1990s from this, but it wasn't until the 2000s that geek became a positive thing, or I should say, when the .com era happened, because then the geeks got rich, and massively so. And it's actually typical if we look at the fields of mathematics, science, and physics, especially if you become a researcher, you work under government contracts and things like that, there's a lot of money to be made, and now in independent businesses, a lot of money to be made. And where do businesses go? Businesses go where the money is. They cater to who has the money. So essentially, we start seeing a shift in our media as well. What we see as advertisements, geeks are becoming a little bit more prominent in media, but sometimes it's more positive images. Or they're starting to showcase more items that are geeky related, that, you know, geek things for the kitchen. And we start seeing that a lot more, to the point where it is now what it is today, that we have geeks very prominent in mainstream media. Disney bought up Marvel. You have a lot of the mainstream media companies that are buying up all of these subsidiaries that had to do with geek culture. We're seeing comics and movies and films, which comes both with its pros and cons, and we'll talk about that in this entire series as it goes forth. But for now, it's just to show you how it's kind of changed. Geek actually now translates to someone who is very enthusiastic in a specialty and or interest. Wow, I mean, what a shift from sideshow freak performer who bit off the heads of animals, or, you know, chunks of them on stage, to this. Interesting to see how those changes happen, because it shows the change of values. Before, geeks weren't that interesting or wanted because socially awkward. And in those particular days, 1950s, 60s, especially if you watch the TV shows, you like the suave main characters. Men had to be of a particular stature and ability and social life, as well as women. If you didn't fit that, you weren't in that group. You weren't the in group. But that's changed. So those people that were the technical ones and without are now the ins, because those are who you want. That's who you're going to cater to. And it's the same with mainstream media in terms of the popular culture that we look at. Popular culture sells, and so you're going to cater to whoever has the most money and now has the most numbers. What's been interesting is to see how geeks have been accepted, or how it's been more accepted or changed in terms of today's society. Looking at, it's cool to like science now, and in fact people want us to like science more because that's what the government needs. That's what the businesses need. The big corporations need scientists, want scientists, because we've become a very scientific fueled, technologically fueled society. So it's been very interesting to look at in terms of geek culture, and how what it used to be and what it used to mean is very important, because it's important to understand then that the geek culture was an ostracized group of people. They were marginalized outside of normal society. And that tradition continued for quite some time, all the way up until the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. It's really interesting to see. There's a great Google document, and I have it down in the description, that shows the use of the word geek. And from 1800s down to 2000s, just about, it's like this. And then all of a sudden, huge spike all the way from the late 1990s to 2000s. And that really relates to the changing nature and value of the word geek, as well as its definition. But what's important to understand about where the word came from and how it's changed now is because there's a schism that's developed. You have these older generation geeks who belong to that group that was ostracized, bullied, not treated with respect because they were considered the abnormals, the weirdo. So there's the schism between who is a geek now and what makes you a geek. But in terms of trying to understand, some people trying to understand where the schism comes from, in terms of a lot of geeks trying to do the whole geek test on you and things like that, it's partly because of what the word geek meant then and what it means now for a newer generation, and what that newer generation of geek looks like. Cheerleaders, jocks who before maybe were still geeks but couldn't say they were geeks because it was termed weird. You'd be weird if you liked science or maths or science fiction novels or Star Wars or maybe anything like that. Whereas today, there's not really that much of a stigma against it anymore in certain senses. It's cool to read comic books. It's cool to go see the comic book movies. It's cool to go to comic book conventions. All of these things now has changed, and it's really important to see how that is affecting us as a society as a whole in terms of getting along with each other, with these older generation who feels like there's a devaluing of that term. And we know that there's a geek culture, but the question we want to ask, is it healthy to identify as a geek solely, primarily? And we see a lot of that. The geek culture has become so prominent that is a main source of identification for some people. And it's important to look at why that happened, what that means, and how that affects different types of identification aspects as well. So that's it for this episode. So yes, if you have questions, comments you want to make, feel free to make them down at the bottom. I'll read them. Or you can definitely feel free to email me at acageekmia@gmail.com. I also do have a Twitter account, which you can follow over here, at Acageekmia. I'd definitely love to hear from you guys and ideas that you have about geek culture and identity and how it's changed and what it means for you to be a geek. So, thanks. Cheers.